What the scariest true story you know? A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or two later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry ECT. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. My maternal grandfather, in the days before hot water on tap, put a big pot on to boil before leaving for work for his wife and kids to bathe with. The pot boiled over and extinguished the flame, and he returned to find them dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. My mother was of his second marriage. The Nutty Putty Cave Incident, https://imga.com/bkmph9v. JPG, a spelunker got stuck upside down in a narrow cave for 26 hours. Crews tried to pull him out with pulleys, but had to be careful not to break his legs, because that could be fatal with the circumstances he was in. Rescuers even almost dislodged him, only for an anchor to fail at the last second, plunging him back into the crevice. He eventually died, and they sealed the cave shut with him inside. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend, and she had the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying/facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely mid-2000s. In the 80s there was a Mexican cult led by an American named Adolfo Constanzo. They used to kidnap random people from tourist towns and nearby cities and perform human sacrifice on them in their rural Mexican desert compound, usually torturing in elaborate rituals for hours or days before finally letting them die. These rituals included vivisections, castrations, eyeball removal, tongue removal, teeth pulling, skin flaying, hanging, etc. They used amphetamines and cocaine to force the victim to stay awake during the torture and not pass out from shock. The cult believed the more pain and fear they could generate in the sacrifice victim, the more powerful the body parts would be as ritual trinkets, and also for food for the cult's nganga, which is a large ritual cauldron used to store bones, blood, meat, and other valuable items that the cult believed gave them power. They used to make staves out of wired together spinal columns, and they would often eat the victim's eyeballs during the rituals. They are believed to have kidnapped and sacrificed over 26 people to their nganga in their 3 years that they were active from 1986 to 1989. The leader committed suicide when the police showed up at their compound. They arrested 14 cult members, but most people believe there were at least a dozen more that escaped and are still out there. The murder of the Green family. A deranged pedo named Joseph Edward Duncan was already on the run from the cops for a past sexual assault. He was incredibly charming and manipulative, and was truly pure evil. He camped outside a family's rural home, unseen by them. He picked it out after driving past it and seeing children's toys outside. He watched them from afar, got to know their routine with the intent of kidnapping the children. 10-year-old Dylan, 8-year-old Shasta. Jed found the lock on the door was broken, entered the home in the middle of the night, and tied up the mom, dad and teenage son. He put Shasta and Dylan in his car and killed the rest of the family with a hammer. He traveled around various campsites and cabins with Shasta and Dylan captive. sexually abusing, torturing and raping them. He eventually shot Dylan, but Shasta talked him out of killing her. Jed ended up telling her she taught him how to love. The scariest part is a CCTV footage of Jed and Shasta at a gas station. Because you could easily believe they were just a normal dad and a grumpy daughter if you were an onlooker. https://youtube.b/zttd Mike. Eventually, he took her to a diner where he was finally apprehended when a waitress noticed something was up, and Shasta was saved after 7 weeks in his clutches. As he was dragged away, he called to her, "Promise me you'll visit me in prison." Jed was put on death row and found to be guilty of 3 previous child murders. He died a few months ago from cancer. But the worst part of it all is how horrible Shasta's life has been afterwards. Drug addiction, in and out of jail, losing her children, etc. Just the most horrifying story ever. When I was 7, I was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard and a beat up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood, and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I did indeed know how. "Yes," I responded. "Give me a hand real quick," he said. So I started walking towards his truck. At the last second, my mom called out to me from the garage, and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, the truck start, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day, about 30 years later. I jump up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and it hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the F? What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory? I was shaking for at least a half hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it. HG, the lone survivor of what would later be called the Wichita Massacre. She was a 25-year-old elementary school teacher at the time and had gone to the triplex where her boyfriend, Jason Beaufort, a science teacher, lived with 2 roommates, Brad Haker, a chemist, and Aaron Sander, who was studying to become a priest. HG settled in front of the TV and began grading papers when Heather Mueller, a friend of Aaron Sanders, showed up. The 5 friends watched TV and eventually retired to their various bedrooms. HG was woken from her sleep shortly after by loud voices and the bedroom door being kicked open. The 2 perps eventually gathered all of the persons in the residence and herded them to the bedroom and ordered them, at gunpoint, to strip. Many atrocities occurred as hours went by, but in the end HG, after being shot in the head in a frozen soccer field, ran naked for almost a mile to find a house with Christmas lights. It was mid-December, to beg for assistance. https://n Wikipedia org/wiki/wichita /massacre. My brother was a police officer. He had a call to check on the welfare of a mother who had not showed up for work. She had died on the sofa and her little toddler had brought the little diaper pad and laid down next to her and died of dehydration. The little kid had opened the lower cabinets and drawers in the kitchen looking for food. He still cries about it, and he's not the crying kind. I grew up on a farm in the Texas Panhandle, the boxy part on top, in a house a few miles from ours. Most of the members of a family were randomly murdered. One girl, 10 years old at the time, survived by pretending to be dead. One day, this kid gets taken to school by his stepmom for a big science fair. Things go well. He has his picture taken. Stepmom watches him go down the hallway to class, and he's never seen again. The Ariel Castro kidnappings. Basically, a man living in Cleveland, Ohio, kidnapped 3 young girls and kept them prisoner in his home in Tremont for 12 years. He even had a child with one. Eventually, one escaped and managed to contact police, who arrested Castro and saved the other 2 girls. In 1949, Timothy Evans was wrongly executed for murdering his pregnant wife and daughter. The actual murderer, John Christie, was a prosecution witness at Evans' trial. After Evans was executed, Christie went on to kill 4 more people. Had the police handled the forensic evidence properly, Christie would have been caught when they were investigating Evans, and those 4 people would still be alive. The government didn't acknowledge that Evans was innocent until 2004. The Broken Arrow killings. 2 brothers brutally murdered their entire family. At one point their young, 5 or 6-ish, siblings were hiding in the bathroom when one of the brothers pretended to need their help. Soon as they let him in, he killed them. One of their last words were, "Please, don't kill me, I love you." Horrifying story. The blue ring octopus has a venom that causes paralysis, causing people to die of cardiac arrest or because of hypoxia. There is no antidote. The cure is CPR or life support for the hour or so it takes for the venom to leave the body. There was a man who was bitten by a blue ring octopus. As the lifeguard was performing CPR, he was lying on his back on the beach, facing the sky, eyes frozen open, unable to close his eyes or communicate with the others. He lied there as the sun slowly burnt out his retinas. He became permanently blind. The USS West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside the ship. Turns out that these noises were people. They were trapped in a room to where they couldn't be broken out of it because of the water that would seep in and drown them, and they couldn't be brought out from the top because of the gases that lingered there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of these 3 men were found. The other things that remained were empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. This means they were trapped in there for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out, and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved. And they had the fear of drowning in the tight little compartment of the ship. They had to face the realization that you are going to die, and the psychological torture that goes along with it. This one kid back in the early 20th century named Bobby Dunbar. He went missing, and after like a year of searching for him, his parents came across a man with a kid who looked a lot like Bobby. They believed it was their kid, and after a legal battle with the kid's supposed mother, they brought the kid home. A wild parade happened due to the missing kid's return. He lived and died believing he was, in fact, Bobby Dunbar. Well, a few decades later, his granddaughter asked Bobby's nephew, I think, for a DNA sample so she could see if her and Bobby's nephew were related. Turns out, they weren't, meaning the real Bobby Dunbar is still missing and probably died alone without his parents. A woman 2 blocks away from my house had multiple children and was pregnant again. I heard my mom talking about her. She has more kids than me, and she about to have another? She's crazy. Mom had 6 of us. One day the lady wasn't pregnant anymore, and there was no baby to be found. Someone told the police about it. The police questioned them and raided their home. They found the newborn dead and stuffed in the freezer. I don't know if it's scary, but when I was younger, me and my twin brother would help our friend do his paper route. One summer we could smell something gross coming from one of the houses. We all didn't think anything of it until 3 days later, when the smell was reaching down the driveway. We went to the back door where he normally dropped the paper and noticed it was open. We went in and looked around the house and found the owner dead. He had died of a heart attack and his cats were eating him. A guy in a sinking ship found an oxygen bubble and only drank a sip of Diet Coke every 7 hours. He was rescued after 60 hours, after being under constant danger from drowning and even sharks. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s, got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it, he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him. After confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA, the lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. The USS Indianapolis, which delivered the bomb to Hiroshima, thanks, Clint from Jaws. The boat delivered the bomb and then, because its mission was top secret, it had a loose window to report in for the next training exercise. Before it arrived, it was sunk by a Japanese sub. Most of the men made it off the ship, but no rescue occurred because the ship was not expected anywhere for a few days. So the men treaded water in the middle of the Pacific for hours, which for the lucky few became days. They made circles to stay afloat and used the oil from the ship for sunscreen. But eventually men would become exhausted and the waterlogged flotation devices no longer worked. So they just drifted away and were quickly eaten by sharks. The oil irritated the skin, and while the ocean was brutally hot during the day, causing dehydration, it was cold enough at night to cure hypothermia. Also, the oil was a mild skin irritant, but so was sunburn. And sharks were a legitimate threat. Survivors would mention who they would look over and see their buddy floating next to them, put their head down and talk to them, only to glance back and see them being pulled away underwater or simply gone without a trace. Eventually hallucinations and delusions set in of the nearly 200 men on the ship. Only 300 went down with the ship at the initial attack. The remaining 900 treaded water in the ocean as long as they could. Only 316 were rescued. 600 drowned. The accounts from the survivors were harrowing. The captain survived, but was overcome with grief and committed suicide in the 1960s, which is a tragically long period to suffer with that guilt. This part is from memory, so I might be misremembering the timeliness. But I know the captain had a life raft and did not have Todd Lowe bad at time before he was discovered, but felt tremendous guilt for abandoning everyone in the water, even though he had no idea. I worked in forensic medicine. My boss had to perform an autopsy on a chopped off head that was found by two completely traumatized children. The autopsy itself took 7 hours because the person had over 56 different injuries to the head. This isn't a scary story, but it's spooky and always captured my imagination. One day a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out. All the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there.